Good evening. Hello, everyone. Hi. Thank you so much for coming to the Kansas City Public Library tonight. We're so thrilled to have you here tonight, and we appreciate you braving the heat for this super cool program. Tonight, we are so happy to be partnering with GUILDit. The goal of GUILDit is to provide a forum for the local art scene to connect with the purpose of building strong art-related businesses. So tonight, please help me welcome GUILDit's Christian Henkel.
Thank you very much. There we go. My name is Christian Henkel. I'm with GUILDit. We are an arts forum where art and business fuses. It is a conversation between the audience and the artists. We do it twice a month. Usually we do it on the first and third Thursdays. We are going to actually switch to some night programs coming up, and I'll get to that in a slide. But first, I need this thing right here. Kansas City resident Mark English has been one of the most awarded illustrators in U.S. history. His unique style is easily recognizable in such publications as Time, Sports Illustrated, Redbook, Atlantic Monthly, and others. His client list includes IBM, the U.S. Postal Service, RCA, GE, Ford, and GM. Hallmark brought Mark here in the 70s to teach their illustrators. In the 90s, he transitioned to a fine art and is represented by galleries across the U.S. Also in the 90s, Mark and his son John started the Illustration Academy and have world-renowned illustrators teach there, like Sterling Hundley. So ladies and gentlemen, Mark English.
Sterling Hundley is also here tonight, featured here, is actually one of my students from years back. I'm very proud of him. He's a very successful illustrator, one of the top guys around. And he represents illustration today. I represent illustration history. My work goes back. I started my illustration career actually in Detroit. When I got out of art school in California, I was hired by an ad agency in Detroit. And as a designer, art director, I was one of the madmen for a short period of time. And then I decided I wanted to be an illustrator. Well, I had never studied painting or illustration hardly, and it was a bit of a time-consuming thing. I worked nights on a portfolio of my work and trying to come up with something. And amazingly, I think I was lucky, but the Detroit art market, automobile market, seemed to love my work, and I became very popular and a very hot item in Detroit. And I went from making $4,000 a year in 1961, I think. And by 1963, my income was $35,000. Now, it doesn't seem like a lot of money now, but back then it was pretty good. It was certainly good going from 4 to 35 as quickly as I did. But I didn't stay in Detroit very long. I painted a lot of, what I did was paint the backgrounds behind cars. There were people that painted the cars, illustrators that just did car illustration. And then there were illustrators who painted the backgrounds, the people in the cars. I painted 1,000 people, little tiny people in the cars, and behind them. You couldn't put a person in front of a car, but you could put them behind them. Anyway, then I'm beginning to learn about the business, and I realized if you wanted to be a big-time illustrator, you had to be in New York. And I left for New York. I had 3 children, bought an old farmhouse up in Connecticut within an hour's drive of New York. And I was about, after I moved there, I was several months without getting a job, and I was getting very worried. Finally got a job from Reader's Digest. But in that interim, those few months that I spent without a job, I worked like hell trying to develop a personal look to my work, which is really kind of necessary to succeed as an illustrator. You have to have a look that's different and more unique from the rest of the world. I managed to do that, and the first job I did won an award at the Illustrator show in New York. I got 3 pieces in, and that's where I'm going to start my slides. And if I know how to do that. There we go. This is one of the first pieces I did for the book Little Women, the introductory picture. And this was a piece from Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And there were about 10 paintings in each book. I didn't show them all. This is another one from Little Women. Little Women again. And again. In those days I worked in acrylics, or I should say I worked in gouache with an acrylic medium. And nowadays I work in oil paint, but all my illustration career, because of the time factor, the time within you, that you had to work fast. For instance, Time magazine only gave me 24 hours to do a cover. And I usually worked all night doing 1 or 2 covers. I guess that's Little Woman again. Story, one of the first stories I did for Redbook magazine. And this is for, I think that was also Redbook magazine. It's hard to remember who, these go way back. I mean, this is in the 60s and early 70s. And again, this is Ladies' Home Journal. I don't know who I did this for. But I did it. I did a series of portraits for the bicentennial in '76, which were, I did them for the Chicago Tribune, and they printed them, made posters out of them. Did a lot of work for the National Park Services. This is George Rogers Clark. An easy assignment because nobody knew what George looked like, so I was... But at this point, my work changes constantly, has from the beginning. And I go back and forth. I mean, I'll come back and do work that's similar to what I did for Little Women, but it's still changing, and I started using more of a design, which is my background. I was a designer originally, and introduced more design and to my work. This is a time cover, again, 24 hours. The cab used to, well, this one I did, actually, I moved to Detroit. But it was still an overnight job. I did 2 portraits of him. And Time keeps the original art. They always have. They have collected everything that was ever published. Another National Park Service, Jefferson as an architect. And that's how much has changed. This is a recent painting. I think there's another one comparing. There was a point when Ladies' Home Journal, whom I worked for a lot, the art director called me into New York to have lunch, and I could tell it was serious. He wanted to talk to me, and he told me that he and the editor thought my people were getting uglier and uglier. And it was true. I told him, I said, I just can't paint pretty people all the time. It's got to be more interesting to me. Many of the figures I did were very vague, which I liked. I didn't like to, this one's fairly specific, but didn't like to identify the character too carefully because I thought the reader should read more into it and imagine who these people were. This is me on the right, my wife on the left, my first wife Peggy, and it's a mystery story on a train in England. Can't remember who I did this for. I believe this was McCall's magazine. Again, I think this was an ad for some corporation. A paperback, obviously Dracula. And I think I've got two, I don't think they're both in here, but I got one very similar I did for the Illustration Academy, which is our workshop that we do every year. I did for the students. They want to know how I did that, and I showed them how it was done. Eddie Bauer cover, I did a lot of Eddie Bauer covers. They had summer, spring, summer, and fall catalogs. And again, this is about a marriage. I illustrated some really terrible love stories. But that was my job. I had to find something within the story when I read it that produced some kind of an image for me that I could make a painting out of. And so anyway, I remember this not being a great story, but I had fun doing it. This is a mystery story for Redbook again, about a detective in France, I believe. Did a number of album covers. I did 3 for John Denver. John and I became friends. When I was working on his albums, he's writing the music, and he'd call me and sing to me on the phone, so I'd know what the songs were like, which was a lot of fun, you know. And the interesting story about this particular picture is that I was given an assignment by the RCA as to what they wanted. They wanted a picture of John on a horse, and et cetera, et cetera. And they wanted a spread where the painting wrapped around both sides of the album. This is the old albums. And I never thought that was a good idea. You put your picture on the front, what do you put on the back? I mean, it didn't make any sense. So I did a drawing to go on the back, and then John loved the drawing, and he said, "Can we put it on the cover?" And I said, "Why not?" I agreed with him. RCA got terribly upset with me and even threatened me. They wouldn't use me again unless I could talk John into change it. I said, "I can't do that," because I already told him I preferred this. So I didn't work for RCA anymore. This portrait of, who is that?
It's Bruce. Bruce. Pete Townsend.
Yeah, Pete Townsend, for Rolling Stone magazine. And cover for Atlantic Monthly, Sigmund Freud, story about him doing surgery on a woman to correct her sexual problems he thought was caused by her nose. And this is a true story. And his daughter revealed it in a letter, and he was not qualified to do surgery, so he got in a bit of trouble for it. Another paperback cover about a poet. And this was also in the Sigmund Freud Inside Atlantic Monthly. This was the patient he operated on. did a lot of work for the pharmaceutical companies. And simply, I mean, they were great to work for. They gave me very simple assignments. Just do a painting of a man with high blood pressure. Well, there's no symptoms, so no visual symptoms, so I just kind of invented it. Another Eddie Bauer winter cover. It was amazing that how many people called and tried to buy the original painting. I still have it. I didn't sell it, but people love ice skating. I mean, it's ice skating enthusiasts. This was Mohawk paper, an ad for Mohawk paper. And I don't remember what this was for. But it must have been for somebody. Series of posters. This is a famous type designer whose name I don't recall.
Mark, I want to thank you for what we're going through right here. This is amazing illustration stuff. You have some really amazing fine art pieces a little bit later on in the presentation.
Yeah. Okay.
Would you want to go to those?
All right, I'll go through it a little quicker. You can see these. This is a lithograph. This was an illustration for somebody I don't remember who, Babe Ruth. And then the first show I ever had was in Chicago, 1979, I believe it was. And it was just simply called The Woman. This was done as a poster. I had a show at the Norman Rockwell Museum and years ago, probably 20 years ago. And it was the beginning of a look that my work, this is a Christmas card for a company in Dallas. And this is the painting of a horse I did for the same show in Tokyo. And this was a show in Tokyo. The other one was for the Norman Rockwell Museum. And they made posters out of it. I still have this painting. It's hanging in my living room. It's a big painting, 5 feet. So, cover of an art magazine, which I don't recall. Figure painting. When I was teaching drawing at the Art Institute, I used to bring my sketches home and convert them into paintings after I got home. Started my landscapes. When I decided to be a painter, I focused on landscapes first. First, fairly representational like this. It's designed, but it's still representational. And then they eventually become more abstract. And I focused on rural farmland because of the opportunity. I'm always interested in abstraction, and it was something I could abstract fairly easily. I could have a couple of figure drawings. We teach figure drawing at our academy, and I do drawings there mostly. I do them for me too, but I do them for the students primarily. This is more recent work. It changed a lot, right, from the beginning. And that's about entertaining me. It keeps me interested in what I'm doing by changing and learning and evolving. I don't know if I'm going forwards or backwards, but the change is keeping me interested. Some of the figures are very abstract. And I'm using collage mixed with oil paint. This is the man with a gun. a jockey, American Indian. I love costume, and I love pattern, and I did a lot of American Indians, and I've done a lot of geishas because the costume was so interesting to me and so colorful. I could, I don't use any reference for these. I mean, obviously, they're great fun. This was a painting about the size that's projected up there. Another geisha done recently in the last 4 or 5 months. Done a lot of horses. I like horses. I've done a lot trying to make each of them different. Here's a Pegasus, another 6-foot painting. The galleries love the horses. They sell. People buy them. And at a certain point, I'm beginning to feel like a whore because they keep asking me to do. One of my favorite horses because it's the most abstract. I've had people look at it and couldn't find a horse in it. I have a friend down Fort Worth who ex-oil man. He and I went to high school together. Still good buddies. And he said people ask him to describe my paintings, and he said the best I can do is I tell him he does paintings that are hard to see. I said that's pretty good. So I said, kind of describes them. Another horse, very abstract, But one of my favorite horses, anyway. This was just a little study I did, thinking I do a lot of studies, small paintings, that are, the purpose of which mostly is to come up with something I feel deserves to be painted large. And I'm having a hard time right now finding anything deserving. There's a cow that's hard to see. And this is just for fun. Just entertainment. So this is the librarian. But I like her. There's another painting I like, very simple. And I have a architect friend that emailed me and said, I can't believe I like that painting, but I do. Done a lot of city scenes. I just invent these cities. Rarely. This one actually was from a photograph, I think. Maybe not. I don't know. And then I do abstractions of a sort. Suggests something. It suggests building, architecture. The paintings vary in size. Smallest I do is about 16 by 20 inches, and most of those are studies for larger paintings. Large paintings are up to 5 feet, 6 feet occasionally. Done one 7 feet high for the Kansas City Chiefs, and another horse. This is like a neighborhood scene with a garden. Oop. You can see the collage where I pasted down paper, and I wet the paper and it wrinkles, and it's fun. It gives the painting a quality that I can't get with paint. And then this guy, something I did recently, kind of weird. And I think that's the last one. This is my studio, and that's the last piece I have to show you. So,
Thank you, Mark.
if anybody has a question, get rid of him. I'll be happy to try to answer it.
We'll do questions at the end.
At the end?
At the end,
Okay.
and then you,
So,
you can both field
Sterling's
questions at the same
coming
time.
up. Sterling Hundley. You're up here.
Mark English. From 2006 to 2008, Sterling Hundley was the most highly awarded illustrator in the U.S. His work has appeared regularly in the pages of Communication Arts and Print magazine. His clients include Rolling Stone, the Grammys, GQ, Scholastic, and the New York Times. He is a professor at Virginia Commonwealth University. He is also the founder of the principal of a Gestalt block company, Ideation Lab, and Legendeer. Ladies and gentlemen, Sterling Hundley.
Thank you. So this is kind of like being the opening act for the Rolling Stones, you know? I know why y'all are here. It's pretty evident that everything that you just saw, it speaks for itself, and there is true greatness in what you saw, and you know this. I also want to mention that in this room, I'm not going to call them out, are 6 of the greatest living illustrators in the world in this room. And they happen to be here because of Mark English and his son John English. And they run a school called the Illustration Academy. And the influence that it's had on the world of illustration is incomparable. It's beyond significance. So if you haven't heard of it, this is something that happens here every summer. And there are students who are the best students from all over the world, and they come here to Kansas City. I know this because I was a student. I went to this program, and the impact that it had on my life was significant, to say the least. So I think that I'm here today to talk a little bit about my work, but more importantly, this is an event put on by a group called GUILDit, and this is about entrepreneurship and for the artists. So if I were to ask you a question and said, okay, what is the worst possible business model that you could ever imagine? All right, so I want to create things that are one of a kind, that can't scale up, they can't be sold. In my career, I can't sell my business. It's the worst business model you can imagine. Well, that's what every creator is trying to do. They're trying to go out and to be one of a kind in the world. They're trying to do something that's distinct. And there's a paradox there that's challenging, it's interesting, it's compelling. And that's what every artist is going through. So if you hear the idea of a struggling artist, that's because they're trying to find themselves. And they work really hard to do it. So talk to you a little bit about my background, influence, imitation, or innovation. And I've been on the cusp of all of those things. So representing past, present, and future. The problem is that we see what's present. We see things that are in front of us. The internet has enhanced this. It has exponentially impressed this upon us. Young artists, young students, they're seeing contemporaries. It's in the best interest of a contemporary to showcase their work, to talk about it, to get more work. So what ends up happening is we get this surface treatment, and we get a lot of things that relate to imitation. Equally important, the past. We have to understand where things came from. We have to understand why people are making the choices that they're making and the things that they're creating. There's always a logic. And we throw this idea of creativity out to the ether and say, oh, it's just a thing that happens. I was inspired. To that individual, there is a creative logic, why they made the thing, the reasons they made, the materials they chose, the audience they're considering. And in order to understand as an entrepreneur where you're going in the future, you have to understand these two pieces that determine where things are going to go. Because things tend not to repeat themselves. Things are created, movements, political movements, creative movements, they're happening as a reaction to something, as a rejection to something. So if you want to predict the future, you have to understand where things came from. So if you want to imitate, you look at the things only in the present. If you want to be influenced, you look to the past. And if you want to innovate, you think about the future. So my past. Images that I've created over the years, I've had two really great models. I've got Mark English and someone else that's in this room again. I won't mention them by name, let them stay anonymous for now. And in their careers, they've inspired me to evolve and to change. And it speaks to my creative nature. The commercial application of my work as an illustrator is secondary to my need to fulfill a curiosity as a creator. Edgar Casey, Virginia Beach clairvoyant. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. I want to talk to you guys about some of the connecting dots here. The cover of my monograph a few years back. This is the deep sea diver who's dove so deep into the depths of the ocean that in search for treasure that he came back with treasure in his hand and love in his heart. And in the center, this is Venus, or the ocean, or his last breath. This piece is called The Bends. Secretariat, raised about an hour from where I live in Richmond, Virginia. Considered one of the greatest athletes of all time. And that last piece, the entire concept was just speed. I just wanted to make the piece look fast. Two scorned lovers cursed by this young lady's parents. Said, she was marrying this elderly statesman, and they disapproved. So the mother cursed them in this life and the next. Two parents passed away before they did, buried in the Jamestown cemetery. Not long after, the young girl, she passed away. And soon after that, the elderly statesman passed away. She was buried about 7 feet from her mother's grave. He was buried next to her. Within several days, a sycamore tree grew between their graves, completely destroyed his. This is what the gravesite looks like above ground. And pushed her grave within 7 inches of her mother's. It gives me goosebumps, right? Shipwreck. This was a really beautiful romantic piece about the ship that wrecked off the coast of Virginia Beach. And the captain, loving his ship, didn't want it to fall into disrepair. Had his crew live on the ship, even went so far as having his honeymoon in the captain's quarters. So I get the publication back. I actually did some writing on the story, found the story, illustrated it. And the magazine was going through a shift at the time, so they changed my story and they titled it Sex on the Beach. wherein intrepid illustrator Sterling Hundley considers the origins of the famous drink. Just an experiment. Hemingway and Faulkner, two contemporaries, respected each other's work in the beginning, grew to dislike each other. You guys see the metaphor here? It's a cliche, right? It's cats and dogs, right? But I came up with this idea having researched Faulkner's past, and I saw that he had a couple Jack Russell Terriers. It just stuck in my mind, right? And I'm speaking to a student actually at the Illustration Academy some years ago, and she said, have you ever heard of those creepy six-toed cats, the Hemingway cats down in Florida? I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So I looked it up, and sure enough, it's a thing. So that triggered the spark, like, oh, Hemingway's a cat guy, Faulkner's a dog guy. There's a story there. Some of you will be familiar with the play Hair. I got to do quite a few theater posters in my career and typography, and like all this goes back to a love for type that developed as an airbrush t-shirt artist at a theme park. I wanted to create the best script and palm trees that there were. Had the good fortune of working on Treasure Island some years ago and got to illustrate that for the Folio Society. And the assignment, 13 pieces, the cover, just about broke me. It's standing on the shoulders of N.C. Wyeth, and that's to give you a bit of perspective. You all have heard the name N.C. Wyeth and Norman Rockwell. Their equivalents are in this room. Contemporary equivalents. I consider this my last illustration of my first painting. Like my heroes. I have constantly been pursuing new opportunities, so I started moving towards a fine art career. Some of that was born, as I said before, I was pushing off of something, some frustrations as an illustrator. And I broke every rule that I knew. I didn't start with sketches, I didn't start with drawings, I had an idea, and all of these started as 3-inch by 3-inch monotypes. So they started with chaos. Everything as an illustrator started with control, and I had to bring that chaos into control. So I was trying to justify the move from a commercial practice as an illustrator into a commercial practice as a painter by doing something that was completely the opposite of what I was known for. So take your ego, crumble it up, and throw it away. So I like to paint horses too. And in these, I was pushing the threshold. I didn't know where abstraction started and representational began. So this is 4 feet by 4 feet. Each of these, again, a monotype. And I knew I was looking for horses. This was a really tragic story about 21 polo horses down in Florida who all died on the field of play at the same time. So that it stuck with me. And I like challenges. Like, could I possibly create a painting that was interesting or attractive enough to somebody that would want to buy something speaking to this horrible event and hang it in their house? I don't know. So in one of the prompts, we were asked to talk about process. And this is something I did for Criterion Collection. It was an Orson Welles film called Immortal Story. And these are just snippets. I'll show you the final here in the end. But starting with loose drawings, I mean, there's an entire process before this begins. Sketches, getting the brief, the text, breaking that down, research, reference. So this is just application painting. You see how it goes from loose and things tighten up. I start very tight and I destroy my drawings, knowing that if I could do it once, I could do it again. And then I rediscover certain passages. And in my paintings, in my drawings, and the things that I write and the things I do in my life, conflict is the constant. I'm always looking for dynamics that are at play. Color application. Maybe I didn't put the final in here. We'll have to do that another day. A quick segment. This is, again, just process. It'll walk you through something real fast. This is not my normal painting. So it's important to show that for a reason because, again, so many creatives and entrepreneurs in this audience. So that particular little study was recorded during an online class that was streaming to a bunch of students. I recorded it on my computer. I resold the video as a tutorial with a voiceover, so I monetized it twice, and then I sold the original painting. So a single image, you have the capacity now with technology to actually scale it up. So leading us to the present and where we're going. I found a great quote by Giovanni Bernini. My bookends are Picasso and Bernini. Okay? If you don't know the work, then they're worth looking up. I love Bernini's work so much, but I was reading about him and I came across this quote, "Never have I felled an errant stroke." Wow, that's amazing. He's never made a mistake. That really bothered me, right? So I thought about it, I was like, well, maybe what he means is there's no good choices without bad choices. There's no right without wrong. It's a contrast and conflict thing. But reading more about Bernini, no, he actually meant that he never. But I got something out of it, right? So moving towards paintings, these are things where I started to reintroduce the narrative, having figured out what one of my thresholds of abstraction are and getting rid of narrative completely. Bringing a very deliberate narrative back in that's an external story married with my own story. I'm not going to explain these. That's the nice thing about paintings is I don't have to. A few things from the series. The series is called St. Hubris. And these are big. I mean, scale is part of it. Time and space are considerations as a painter that are different than when you're an illustrator. When you're an illustrator, you're working with very small things oftentimes that scale up to sometimes billboards, sometimes the side of Google, things like that. But paintings, they're artifacts. They're meant to be seen in person. So we have this contrast of the image versus the artifact. So they have different functions, right? So those are just things that you consider as you make these and you think about the different audience. And someone who goes to a gallery or a museum, they have leisure time at their disposal. They've chosen to be there versus a blue-collar illustration, which is vying for their attention. This was lives somewhere in Moscow now. So that last one was 8 feet tall. This one's a small study. So again, horses and dogs. There's St. Hubris, otherwise known as ambition. And where things are going. So on the work of Jackson Pollock, his seemingly chaotic abstractions were in reality the recording of intention, movement, and sequence. It's not actually a quote, I just wrote that. But in reading about his work and looking at his work, I didn't like it. I didn't get it. Like's not a good word. I don't like the word like. I didn't get it. And a lot of people get it, and that bothered me. I didn't get Bonnard, I didn't get Vuillard, I didn't get Picasso, I didn't get all these artists. Like, the problem is not with them, it's with me. I got to figure this out. So read into why they made the choices they made. What was happening in the world at that time? How was it different than what came before? How did they change the perception of art in the world? Those are important things. And it goes well beyond the aesthetic only of an image. So it's interesting, as I'm looking into these things, this is just a snippet of a work in progress, but I'm doing things now. I've got this challenge, and some of you will recognize this. So I'm a father. I have 2 kids. I've got a 7-year-old daughter and 2-year-old son, and truly, I don't just say this, they are the best things that I'll ever make. And I live in the future. My head is always on the next problem. It's always trying to figure out the next thing. And when you have kids, all you want to do and all you should do is be present. So that's an issue. And I had to figure out, what could I do in my life that would allow me to include my children in it? I'm not going to just go to the studio. I want to involve them in creativity somehow, and I want them to learn from it. So I turned the focus of my artwork not from an external narrative, but into an internal narrative. And I started to focus on my own life as a story. And the new body of work, these are embedded canvases throughout my house. They live behind TVs and the sofa, and it lets me pick them up, and if my kids are sitting there watching TV or something, I get to see them, interact with them, and participate in their lives. And that scales up. This is digital color application. I grew up, I'm such a geek, I love comic books, and they had a huge influence on me. I have a graphic novel that I'm writing. It's about a superhero influenced by the story of Secretariat. Everything is connected, right? Everything comes full circle. And it's just this thing, I get excited about stories and comics and all that stuff. And I guess as a painter, that's kind of where I'm going. You'll see notes of Guernica coming through this, and graphic qualities of spot inks from comic books and the characters and everything else, and typography. it's okay if it all lives in the same person and in the same space. So I was commissioned a while back, and I've got a friend who works at Capital One Bank, and he introduced me to his boss, who's in charge of the user interface and innovation for Capital One and where it's going. And they commissioned me to do a piece, an installation at Capital One headquarters. And if these look familiar, this is how those paintings started, the abstract monotype. So each one of these is house paint, white paint, brushed on, and then a pool of ink that you just dip the blocks into. And it was designed as a scalable concept. It was the Gestalt block project is this. It's modular. It moves from 12-inch by 12-inch panels. It can go as large as you want or as small as you want. I can integrate other people to help me realize these things. I hired a craftsman, a woodworker, Jim Daigle, who's fantastic. He brings things to the collaboration that I could never do. And I think that's where you start to look at innovation and where you might move forward with your work is how do you get other people involved and how can they exponentially enhance a project that you're working on? So the intention of this work is to first invite the viewer to touch the artwork. Because it's different. You don't go to a gallery in a museum and touch the artwork. So I want to do something that invites participation. And by default, what ends up happening is my intention with the work changes the moment someone else moves a piece. And they start to see faces and they start to see things. We give them prompts and they start to organize dark with dark using Gestalt principles and light with light. They start to create these drawings. And I've got someone on the inside who keeps sending me photographs of things that people are doing. And I'm amazed at their creativity and their innovation with it. So the secondary part of that is it puts me in role of the viewer as the artist. So again, thinking about my future, my kids, and challenges and frustrations, if somebody asked me, what are the things that are important to you in your life, I would say, oh man, my health, because if I'm not healthy, then I'm dead and I'm not here for the people that matter. And then it's relationships, the hierarchy of my family, my kids, my wife, my parents, my brother, nephews, colleagues, peers, friends. And I then think about, okay, well then it's art and education. Those two things are really important to me. So my business, and then recreation is like always pulling up the rear. And then I looked at my life and was like, man, I'm so unhealthy. I sit around the studio all day, painting, breathing in terrible things. I get shoulder problems and back problems, and I'm letting myself go. And it isolates me from my family and my relationships. And the things that drive me are money and the exposure of the work. And there is no recreation still. So it presented a problem. And I think that the greatest thing that we can equip the youth with these days is getting them to change the perception that we're not all just problem solvers. If you ask me, we wear it with pride. I'm a problem solver, and that's great. That's a really important thing. But being a problem solver implies that you have a problem to solve, which means that someone else has framed the problem, and you're helping them realize a solution to their problem. But who's framing the problems in the first place? Who's creating the companies? Who's driving things forward? Artists have the capacity to be all of those things. They can identify problems that need to be solved. They can use their creativity to actually bring that to reality. And we don't need the involvement of everybody else. It can enhance things, but we don't need it. So I took those categories. I said, okay, health, relationships, business, and recreation. Can I frame a problem that I could solve through a new endeavor? And from that was born a program I called Legendeer. And Legendeer is learning to value your own story as the catalyst of creative outcomes and teaching people to think about these things a little bit holistically and differently so that there's a marriage of what is now called experiential learning, which the problem with experiential learning is it implies that there's a lack of experience. It's points to a deficit of a human experience these days because everybody's looking down and nobody's looking up anymore. And so we're trying to get professionals and college-age students, and I'm trying to scale this throughout schools down to getting my daughter to go out legendeering with me. And she's got her sketchbook, and we're taking note cards, and we're finding clues. She's trying to solve the mystery. The mystery is some nefarious creature that lives in our neighborhood, and he leaves clues everywhere. That's a clue. Daddy, that's a clue. That's a clue. And she draws them, and she sketches them. And we go back to the house, and we take the note cards. I was like, well, how do you think he got from here to here? Well, he used the manholes in the sewers to get from here to here. Obviously, Dad. All right? So she's learning to tell stories, and she's learning to write. And the ability, the capacity to author, I think, is one of the things that certainly I hold in the highest regard, because it encapsulates not only the ability to create, but the catalyst and the justification for doing it in the first place. So we're bringing spoken word poets and illustrators and artists, entrepreneurs, innovators, writers, rock climbers, athletes, and we're trying to embed creatives back into the world as thought leaders. And I didn't know what my bellwether was for this. I didn't know how to measure success, certainly not financial success. But we took a group out to Yosemite National Park last year. We quite literally took a group from San Francisco, put them on a bus after a 2-day workshop, and we drove out to Yosemite, and we stood here, guided by, you guys know Jeremy Collins? He's a superstar here in Kansas City. That's my bud. That's Jeremy Collins right there, and he was teaching a bunch of artists and creatives about gear that's required to climb a mountain. And we put our hands at the base of El Cap, and we looked up 3,000 feet. And not a single person from that group of 60 people walked away and didn't say that it changed their lives. Right people, right place, and it was significant. Baron Story, remarkable human being. He teaches, he's taught with us at the Illustration Academy. Rob Gibson, former student of mine. If you don't know Rob Lou Gibson, look him up. He's a remarkable spoken word poet. So I just want to get people back out doing things, and it's amazing. Our little program, Legendeer, I told you I didn't know how to measure the bellwether, what the bellwether was on that. It's attracting the right people. The right people, I don't have to work to find them. The kind of people that you want to spend your life with, they're coming to me and saying, that's what I want to do. That's important. And I think that's all I could ask for from this thing. So I was invited, because of this, I just killed it. I was invited to Norway. I had a solo show. I ran a Legendeer program out there. I was invited down to Bogota, Colombia, where I was embedded in Bogota for a week. And we went to 3 different places and kind of triangulated information. And I had 2 days to paint a mural 80 meters. Well, I think that's what it was. I messed up my math. Something like 30 feet or 25 feet tall is my first mural. And so this is, you can't see, but there's an opening in the bridge here. I was provided this space, and this is an ode to the farmers in Colombia who spilled their blood to bring life to the city. He's cutting a fruit. You can't see this here. Blood drips down, hits the other fruit. And these are all fruit that we found in the market. Trickles down, goes, his feet are covered in blood, but the city pops up behind him. These are the 2 mountains and the church that we also visited. And at nighttime, you can't quite see it, but there's this V that happens and this shadow that casts here, and that's literally the intersection of where the blood drips and hits and falls down. And it completely changes by day. So the sun comes in, hits the blade of the knife, and casts a shadow. So those are the types of things that I geek out about. I love being in a place and putting my hands on things and experiencing life. And I think that the pendulum is swinging, that's where people are realizing that they want to be too. So just a random smattering of things that are always in front of me. I am bouncing around all the time. I do pen and ink work and this work and that work. And I think as an entrepreneur, self-empowered innovator, you look at opportunities as a way of breaking down silos. And if you can identify patterns, if you can recognize that a silo exists in the first place, and you can connect the dots for people and build bridges between one silo and another, you get to be the gatekeeper. You get to be the person who's collecting the tolls. And that's, I think, where innovation lives, is in building bridges. So I think that's all I got. I want to thank everybody for having us here.
Thank you, Sterling.
Thank you.
Sterling Hundley. We are going to have some question and answer here. We like to think of it as a conversation. I'm just going to kick this off. I read in an interview that you gave. You had this idea of assumption meeting reinforcement. And I was wondering if you could maybe just speak about that for a moment. I thought that was a really interesting idea.
Yeah, I mean, I teach, I guess it's a revelation. All these things, they seem so calculated, I guess, in retrospect, but so much is just a gut instinct, and you're moving forward. One of the things I love about teaching is I have to explain intuition. It doesn't, nobody any good to say, well, felt right. That doesn't transfer. So what I realized is that every choice that I've made in my creative career and the things that I do, ever since like my genesis of identity when I was 4 years old or 5 years old and realized I was an artist, has been built around some assumption that I have when I create, that it will be validated in some form. I don't make things just out of randomness. It's like, no, I want this to do this. I want people to react a certain way. I want to speak to something. I have something that I need to get out of me and out to the world. And so that's the model of assumption versus validation, that if the validation comes, that becomes the measure of success. If the thing that happened, that you wanted to happen, happens, that is the test. And so you get, when you're innovating, there is no roadmap. There is no one to say, well, if you do this and this, that's a great painting. Because those criteria are already established. And if you're trying to do something that's never been seen before, how do you define where to go? So you have an intention, and you clearly articulate that intention just to yourself. And then that validation hopefully comes.
And then you both have, you moved from illustration into fine art painting, and then you've both moved into these entrepreneurial concepts. I was wondering, Mark, if you could talk about the Illustration Academy that you started with your son, John, just a little bit.
Yes. I think we started the Illustration Academy 20 years ago, and we used facilities at William Jewell College. Now we're doing it at Rockhurst, but we hoped to attract fairly advanced students coming out of college, young professionals, and very serious students, and we have. Our students have been extremely serious about what they're doing. And it's frustrating to teach someone that isn't. My son kind of took it over from me. I didn't want to spend as much time with it as he could, and I just wanted to paint, but I'm still involved. We have all these great instructors. They come from all over the country, great illustrators, professionals that know what the hell they're doing. They know more than art professors, forgive me, but that's a matter of fact, because they've experienced it. And they are serious illustrators and painters. And we've managed to attract students from all over the world. We have 9 students from different countries in our workshop this year. We have 50 students. And we've got, I don't know how many instructors we got there now, but We've got terrific instructors. It's been very successful. You know, he's a product of it. And I'm not saying we taught him everything he knows, but we helped him face. People realize when they come what's required of them to become a professional, and it's a shock. It was for me years ago in Detroit when I got mixed up in the business and saw what professionals were capable of. It was like, oh, that's an education. This is where I've got to be. I've got to be up here to compete, and that's what these students at the workshop are learning. And we're teaching, them to draw. We're teaching them the basics. We're teaching them concept. I think it's very effective.
I tell folks that the Academy taught me what I don't know. You know, you realize what you don't know when you're faced with the truth and information.
So we just have a few minutes here. We'd like to open up the floor. If you have any questions, comments about the business of art, about the process of art, please raise your hand. We're going to bring you a microphone because it's really hard to hear, especially up here. So if anybody has a question or something, or I can just keep talking. Here we go.
It's on. Okay. I think you said you worked for Scholastic. Does that mean you illustrated the books and that kind of thing? What was your favorite book to illustrate, and why was it your favorite?
Well, it's not going to be some major title that you've heard of. I'm trying to remember. I've done 5 or 6 different books for them. I'd have to look it up. I don't even remember I remember the illustrations. And the titles of the book elude me right now, so that's a terrible answer.
Why was it your favorite?
It was, it's always story for me. If I can get into a story, it's always the thing that grips me. And, just finding some nuance and different way of explaining that. I just remember it was a young boy and there was a tree, and I remember my solution to the story, but it's always the best articles and the best writing that leads me to get excited about a project. Or even more importantly, I've done a number of stamps at this point, and someone who has an interesting life, it's a great story, and I want to help tell that. So I wish I had a better answer for you.
Over here. Hello, I would like to know if, in order to get into your academy, if you have to submit a portfolio, and also how long does the duration of the training, and how much is it?
The workshop, where's my son?
So
it lasts, the workshop lasts for 5 weeks. I can't tell you the cost of it.
But you can elect to just go 1 week, right?
yes, you can opt for just a week. And I think directing the question to John, he can answer some of those details afterwards. I'd like to connect you to, if we can, he can speak to the details on that. I haven't reviewed the portfolios in a while, but I will tell you that when I got in, my portfolio was reviewed, and I mean, it was an honor to get into the program. So I think they may have just let me in because they liked me, but you know, it was it's something for a very long time that I held in high regard.
There was a point, and it happened to more than one student, but I remember Sterling telling me he didn't think he was good enough to be in the program, and he was the star student, really.
We have one here.
So I happened to hear Mark English this morning on NPR, and then listening to both of you. You guys have come from this very structured background. where I believe, as Mark put it this morning, he said, being an illustrator is easy because someone hands you this problem, right? And something that Sterling mentioned is who's framing the problems. So as you guys have transitioned from this very structured world where it's like, okay, here's the problem, here's the narrative, go solve it creatively, can you guys speak to sort of the struggles or maybe the revelations that you have had as you've transitioned into creating your own problems through your fine art and sitting down and saying, okay, now it's up to me to define this story, and now it's up to me to define what the caliber of the work is I'm going to make. So how have you stepped into that role?
She's talking about the transition from illustration into painting, and how do you move from being given structure to basically getting to paint whatever you want? How do you make those choices?
Well, actually, in some ways, illustration was easier than being a painter, I think. It's not now, but originally it was. I had a hard time deciding where the line was drawn between illustration and painting, because, good art can be illustration or good art can be painting, or vice versa. But I first had to decide what I would do differently to be a painter. And basically what it comes down to is the difference in painting and illustration. In a few words, is an illustrator works with other people's problems and tries to solve them. A painter gives himself problems and tries to solve them. And I think that's harder sometimes as a painter. I get very excited. I get an idea, I can get very excited, and I get very up, and I work very hard. I kind of work nonstop when I'm excited. And then after it's done, I'm more than likely to go into a low, and I can't think of anything else to do. And what my next, challenge is, and where I'm going to go. And the way I recover from that is I keep working. I don't stop. I do sketches, thumbnails. I do little tiny drawings that big, trying to, just searching is what it amounts to.
If I can touch on that real quick, it's, I've been through this, and I've seen artists and students go through this, and, it's, at this level, it's not facility. It's not that you're trying to paint better, that you hope that's a byproduct of pushing forward and doing more paintings. And it's not about the space or the dimensions or the time. The hardest thing for me is always the content. What do you paint? How do you validate what you're painting? And we all do this thing where it's like, my life is not that interesting, and it's not. No one's going to care, and so the thing real quick that I rattle through is like, you as an artist, you have to have something to say. Everybody on earth has something to say. That life humbles you, it puts you through tragedies and triumphs, and it can be incredibly interesting. If you don't believe me, look at the best painters in the world. They paint what they see and what they experience and do something with it. Even if it's a foil and they tell a fiction.
Well, I think it's very difficult to figure out what you have to say.
Yeah, well, that's kind of where I was going. And like the next thing is you have to have the means to say it. So that's skill and facility. And the third thing is you have to have something worth hearing. And I word it that way because we put that power in other people's opinions. I have to, no one's going to care what I have to say. And the fourth step, to Mark's point, is you have to say it. You actually have to take action, even when you have those doubts, to make it happen. And I wish there was a better formula than that, but you have to do it. You have to work and discover what you like and dislike through trial and error.
Another point is that the instructors there, I forgot how many we have, 8 or 9 instructors, maybe more, that are coming here are all very professional people. The things that the students are struggling with, most of them, not all of them, but most of them, are struggling with the basics, the foundation, learning to draw and paint, the skills. I don't think Sterling and I or any of the other instructors involved or struggle with that or think about it too much. I draw, but I don't struggle to draw. I paint, I don't struggle to paint. I just struggle with my thoughts of what it is I want to paint and what I want to do. And
But if you struggle with painting, that's all you think about. Like, how do I get to the place with skills? So it kind of depends on where you are.
yeah.
We don't have time for any more questions. Along the lines of what you were just talking about, there's another quote that I read from you, and I'm probably going to butcher it, but it was that illustration answers a question, but painting asks the question. And I thought that was a really awesome way of putting that. I had never thought of it that way. I need to grab this clicker here. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark English. And Sterling Hundley. All of their contact information is here. Please take a photograph of this page, and then you can go and see their stuff and get in contact with them. From Gilded, thank you so much for coming out. Thank you to the library for having us, and thank you to all of you